Yeah.
Okay, I think we are now pushing this thing to YouTube. And once again, the Resurrecting Civility podcast, amateur hour conversation between three guys trying to be a little less clueless is underway. Take 9.
Take
So
9.
Rose, you were following up just a second there ago about from our last conversation, our last open topic conversation, which had to do with policing, racism, etc. And I thought that was a good conversation, by the way, and I'm really looking forward to another version of it. And I did actually once follow again the stuff. The Resurrecting Civility podcast. Sorry, don't forget to have to mute. Right. Okay. There's a small time delay, as you might have gathered by yourselves. So, yeah. Okay. I don't know if you guys saw, I did a follow-up. I sent you a little pretty radical take on the defund movement.
Yeah, from that counter punch.
That's right, from the Code Pink organizer. And yeah, she's kind of the real deal. I had seen her before, but I didn't know I had seen her before. So I did a little research on her before I sent you that piece, just so I'd know what I was sending. Yeah, I read it, but I didn't chase every single link. You know, what kind of credibility should I put? And put it this way, it's at least the case that she is a regular, very active voice in the space. She's a known quantity.
Yeah.
I kind of like her. But anyway, we perhaps can swing back into that. But maybe not now.
It's a. I found the article. We don't have to talk much about it. I would just say I found the article compelling, compellingly written for sure. It kind of reminded me of. This isn't perfect, but something in a similar vein. I was reading War Talk by Arundhati Roy, which is about the conflict in, at least the first couple chapters are mostly about the Hindu nationalist movement in India. And this book had been written back in like 2005. But anyway, that's a good book. But the reason I bring it up is because the language is similarly intense, and sort of clearly has a pretty clear idea about what's going on, and or clearly thinks they know what's happening, and says what they think eloquently. Yeah.
I like it. Yeah. I'll look that up. Maybe you could send a link in the chat box or via WhatsApp or something.
Sure.
Or maybe by Messenger, since you can get to both of us at the same time that way. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I'd like to go back to that topic too. I have to admit, right now, my head has been full of dialectical reasoning today. And so if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to plunge into it as promised.
Sure.
And see if we can make some headway. So this is our yet another take on sort of truth, goodness, the version of truth and goodness that arises out of the social information processing model, that high information flow network of rich communities model, or whatever you call it, and its relationship to conscious realism. And there does seem to be one, and we're going to try and get at that today, and also get at the kind of argumentation that's going on when we make these sorts of connections. What on earth kind of reasoning is this, and should we put any trust in it? Good question. So now I pulled up a way too busy slide. Sorry about that, but we're going to go through it super fast. And all it does is tighten up slightly what we talked about last time. So in general, the movement of thought here is to go from this, what I'm calling SIP, and this really is the high information flow network of rich communities algorithm, something like that. It begins with an experiential, it begins by taking conscious experience as information and begins to build from there. Add some other things, add some social dimensions, some cognitive, some non-cognitive formation, et cetera. Adds an algorithm from McIntyre about how communities can talk to one another, even when the standards seem incommensurable. All of that is what's meant by SIP here. Social information processing on that model. And I'm suggesting that, more than suggesting, I'm trying to actually build an argument. Say it goes so far as to be implication, but then what's the difference between implication and suggestion? That's part of the background here. So what's the journey like from social information processing on this model to conscious realism? I do think there's an important push in this direction. And the cool thing is it seems to parallel the push that Hoffman thinks evolutionary science is impelling, right? There's a push toward conscious realism from evolutionary science. And also he thinks there is a push toward, put it this way, there's an opening of space for conscious realism being pushed by contemporary physics. The space-time is dead, something else is going on. That sort of movement, and as you know, Wolfram seems to be in that space too. I don't mean the conscious realism conclusion there, but that something more fundamental than space and time and some kind of computation is going on there. The Hoffman suggestion is that computation is taking place in a network of conscious agents. That's where it sits. And I'm suggesting that there's a third argument, not based on either of those sciences, for that sort of conclusion, that conscious realist conclusion. And it takes place in two stages. First, there is an associated account of truth and goodness that follows from this account of social information processing. It's an interesting one, and it seems to follow naturally. And in this argument here on this page, I'm suggesting it doesn't just seem to follow naturally, but from the very possibility, once you state it, you can argue that it's the only candidate in town. That's what the argument is on this page. And then there's a second part. Once that candidate is accepted, once you think that there is such a thing as this account of truth and goodness on this social information processing model, then it implies conscious realism. And both of these arguments are going to be developed in something like reasoning from hypotheses down to conclusions, something like formal arguments, formal deductive arguments. And then we'll want to get at, is that really right? Or what on earth is going on here? And that's setting the table for today. I won't spend long on this slide here. Please help me stay to it. I just tried to tighten up that argument that wasn't very tight last time. And it goes something like this. That first of all, that high information flow network of rich communities algorithm, it's coherent. I think that's an important place to start, because if it's not coherent and you're smuggling in a contradiction, then anything else follows, right? So I'm saying that approach is coherent, thus that there is sort of a set of outcomes. I don't mean a single set of outcomes. It could splinter into all kinds of different communities. None of which survive interaction with the other ones, right? And every strange combination. But my only point is you're going to get an output, right? When you put conscious experience into that system, there's an algorithm, and there's going to be a set of outcomes. And that's a coherent idea, point one. And the second is that there is an associated set of standards of goodness and truth, basically stable inclination, stable ascent, that seems to follow from, that seems to play nicely with that account of social information processing. And here too, I'm putting in as a premise that this also is coherent. There, it is a possible state of affairs, at least a epistemologically possible state of affairs. We might need more than that, but it does seem to be, nothing about it seems like that doesn't make any sense. It does seem to make sense. It hangs together. It seems to be coherent. If somebody could attack it on this basis, the whole argument would fall apart. Right? No, it's not coherent. It entails a contradiction. Okay, then everything follows. So no wonder why you proved every other conclusion you went on to prove. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
So starting with these claims of coherence. All right. So that cleans, that's, I feel, by the way, John, like I'm writing a program, and I'm I'm setting my classes or something at the beginning. This is, would you know better than I do, but it feels like that. Okay. So now the argument goes, as you know, consider any other combination of alternative accounts of what's true and good. And it basically says, this is not going to get you anywhere. And it takes you through piece by piece to show you that. And it does it this way. Here too, either these two sets, first and second, converge or diverge. This is a truth of logic, I think. What I mean by diverge is doesn't converge, right? To converge is to imply the same set of truth and goodness assignments to judgments and inclination, and to diverge is any other set of implications than that. So it looks like this is logically complete. And then we investigate each one of these disjuncts.
But that is, it does, just to make sure, I mean, it seems like it is possible for the set of standards output, like the set of standards, there could be multiple ones that are stable. Or are you saying,
that's
if
right,
that question makes sense, right? I mean, it's not that everything is going to collapse to a single, like every community is going to converge to the same truth and goodness points, right? That's not what you're saying.
Correct.
There can be multiple stable communities, multiple rich, stable communities.
Without putting data in, that's right. You have to run the experiment.
Yeah. But that isn't implied in the argument.
That's right. So there might be multiple truths on this view.
Yeah. Okay.
There might be incoherent, incommensurable. Sorry, incoherence, not what I meant. I'd have to think about incoherence. It seems to me the system works out incoherence. People aren't enduringly attracted to incoherent states of affairs. But can I prove that? No, I don't think so. I haven't even thought about how to argue for it, but it seems to me it might be true anyway. But what I meant was incompatible or incommensurable outcomes seem entirely possible.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay.
I mean, maybe everybody has their own, or or maybe people cohere and agree with one another when they, insofar as they share and articulate what it is that they're thinking. Maybe they attract other people, and that can be done. Obviously, that can be done in different ways, quite substantially. We know there's empirical evidence for that already.
Yeah.
And so how will this algorithm run in the end? Don't know.
So that means any other combination of alternative accounts, they could converge to any other point, right? There's multiple points to which they could converge, right? If that makes sense. Just
Any
because
other,
there's as long as they converge to one of the communities that we're talking about, then this it's still coherent.
no, this is interesting. So what I think you're talking about now is what I'm talking about now in the argument, and that is not just any outputs, but outputs with regarding the nature of truth and goodness, right? So
Yes.
I'm not granting that point. So
Huh.
if I granted that point, this argument would fall flat. So
Okay.
so this is precisely what I'm trying not to grant. In fact, I'm trying to argue that there is no other account, that once you grasp this account, not where it leads, not how many systems end up surviving as outputs. So not how many truths there are, not how many incompatible accounts of truth or of goodness ultimately in the end,
Mm-hmm.
not how many irresolvable disagreements there are. The field might be littered with those, but it
Okay.
won't be littered with alternative accounts of truth and goodness. Not once you accept SIP. That's exactly what this argument is.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Which
It
is a pretty
does,
interesting thing. So it's go ahead.
but it does that I guess I'm confused at the difference between uh that point and then from the point before where you said there were stable ones. I'm confused at the difference between those things.
There are stable whole systems, but it doesn't follow that there may very well be. Nothing we've said so far precludes the existence of stable and enduringly incommensurate systems for which McIntyre's algorithm produces no decisive
I
victor.
see.
That is possible.
Yeah.
Right? But none of those that endure will have an alternative account of truth and goodness written into them. And
Okay.
that makes
Okay.
this a remarkably strong claim, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's basically saying, guys, this is how it works. This is what truth and goodness are. As long as you grant this set of initial principles, that you start from the reality of conscious experience amongst multiple conscious agents that can parallel process information, exchange information in ways that puts other agents in contact, in causal contact with the output of other people's conscious deliberations.
Yeah.
In other words, we can talk, reason with each other, and we can pass down those results in non-cognitive ways.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we can build
I feel yeah. I feel good about our understanding of what the SIP part of it, but
Yep.
I guess I just wanted to be clear in my mind that what you're trying to say is you're trying to establish some base, like McIntyre talks about, some basis for comparison, like some standards,
Some
right?
algorithm.
That you could appeal to.
I'd say so. This is correct.
Okay.
I'm saying this algorithm, once you grasp it, it bites you, you're going to hang on to it, and everything else you're going to let go of. Everything else that every other account of the end, as in purpose, ends versus means, every other account of the end of rational inquiry, theoretical or practical, is going to lose when it comes up against this. It's either going to be worthless because it simply maps onto it.
Yeah.
Or it's not going to map onto it. And then you're going to have a choice to make, and you're going to go this way every time, which is really quite claim. Okay, that's the
Yeah.
substantial claim that this fourth line of thought here. That's um, what follows from if they diverge. So let's
Yeah.
look at that for a moment, and it all comes down to a central question: what could make a rational person diverge from the pathway to the endpoint of theoretical and practical inquiry in that full information processing approach? In other words, in that, sorry, I lost how
Yeah.
to read. It's too small, right? In other words, in that maximally informed set of relationships with other people in the world, all things considered.
Yeah. I mean, there's no reason to think that a rational person could. That's the most important part of this. It seems of this. It's like if you're trying to say that, and only on irrational agents could separate from this.
If you don't
It's
engage in this process, you don't work somehow, right? Um, the, you are deficient in some way. Um, in other words, you ought not to be doing something other than this. You ought to. Um, there is sort of a standard of. You could see this really as a standard of rationality.
yeah.
It is expose the things, and it's all built into that very simple little phrase: information improves choices, not
Yeah.
in a linear way, right, but as a general rule, in a general way. And in fact, you can say more than just as a general rule, and we've said a little bit more, right, in terms of the way societies function in processing information. And including in that is the way they can function in processing information at very high levels of attainment. How is it that you get in contact with a huge amount of information processed non-cognitively, not only in your tradition, but in anyone's tradition? There's an algorithm for that. And if you don't want to play, right, then your life is worse. Information improves choices, not linearly, but in general it does. And if you simply don't want to engage and say, no, 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 I'm happy right here, thank you, right? And you may continue you're quite welcome to be happy right there once you see what other alternatives are. But if you bury your head in the sand, you have stepped out of the rational processing game.
Yeah.
You're no longer an information processor. And on the whole, we think this is bad for you, right? If we could get you to see this, you will not stay in that. You would not keep your head in the sand. But it may be difficult to get it out.
Yeah. I think I'm with you, and I think I just wanted to. I guess the key thing I wanted to understand was I guess I wanted to make sure I understood what you were doing as far as establishing the standard as, at least I thought I wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying in the argument, and I think
Yep.
But I also wanted to make sure that we were appreciating the significance of the rational element in it, because I don't think it makes any sense at all if you allow for people to act irrationally, right? They're just not participating anymore in the
Right.
process.
That's right. And
Okay.
there is a kind of persuasion that one needs to master for those people if you're going to build a healthy community. But it isn't the kind of persuasion that you use for people who are rationally engaged.
Okay.
I mean, I have in mind, this is the wrong, I can't turn down it when a really nice scripture passage pops to mind. Be not like horse and mule, unintelligent, needing bridle or bit, else they will not approach you. It's an appeal. It's like, don't step out of the game, dumbass, right? That's exactly what that phrase is saying, right? And if you do, I mean, you can entice them, you can entice such people in various ways. But as the guys say at the very beginning of the Republic, how could you ever can persuade us if we won't listen? They're joking about that, actually, right? And that may be an important rhetorical element in the Republic, but that comes up that'll be another time. Okay.
All right.
The only reason I dropped the Republican is because we're actually hoping to go there later on, because it's just important to acknowledge that what we're doing here has been done before. Okay, so then this is the basic argument. So nobody ought to follow any other alternative. Why? Because it diverges from the first, right? And nobody ought to be pulled from that activity. This is an account of rationality that appeals. It is information processing. It's paying attention. It's letting things in, right? I mean, it's being open to new thought, new experiences, and letting those shape your judgments, shape your inclinations over time. And that, when you put it that way, how do you turn that down? Right? If another, and when you've achieved a kind of stability of outcome, that's suggested here as that's what we mean by running on all cylinders, right? Or we use the analogy there, right, of the image of running on all cylinders. You are flourishing as a rational agent. You are taking in information, you are processing it, right? And you may very well run into all kinds of troubles, but you try to work your way through them. And when you succeed, that is success. Don't get out of that game. If you do, right, it is true that you're falling short of some standard, and you ought not to follow any standard that pulls you in a different direction. Which is what the truth and claims about the truth and claims about goodness purport to do that. They say, no, think this way. No, desire these things. Truth claims and good claims about goodness pull you in a different direction. And if they don't pull you in the same direction, this information processing direction, you shouldn't go. And of course, if they don't diverge, then you shouldn't follow them either, right? They're useless, unless, of course, they actually harmonize. Unless they're really not different, they're actually the same and even better. So they might imply all the same. Some new story might come to town, and it wouldn't be that new. It would add something to what we mean by the stability of inclination and assent. Maybe there's more to be said about it. And maybe when you say more about it, you see more clearly, and it can do more work for you. Maybe so. That would be a friendly amendment. But that's one that doesn't diverge, but isn't useless, right? And that was acknowledged above. In a certain way, it converges. In a certain way, it diverges in that it does more for you. It does what the first set does and even more. And if you got those, that's great. But if it doesn't do what the first one does, you ought not to follow it. And if it only does what the first one does, it does no work for you. At best, it's the same standard, and at worst, unless, of course, it sheds more insight, unless it slips into this little category right here. It harmonizes and perhaps does even more for you, right? So that is a possibility. But if it doesn't do that for you, if it doesn't harmonize, you ought not to follow it. If it does harmonize and does more for you, then you should follow it. But if it harmonizes and does nothing more for you, it's superfluous. and you shouldn't accept a superfluous account of the truth and the good. This first one does a good deal of good for you, right? It basically lets you know what the end point of inquiry is. It gives you a rich, satisfying answer of where we're heading, right? When we inquire.
Isn't the whole argument that there couldn't be another system that does more for you, though? Because this is the best one.
When we say the best, we just mean the best account of truth and goodness.
Right. So
that's right. All kinds of people might accept this account of truth and goodness and be very different players in the league. Right. And really
so they're doing more in other areas, not just truth and goodness, is what you're saying?
Well, no, I'm saying that if I was limiting my argument here to just claims to be a different account of truth and goodness. Not those might be woven in. Someone might have an account of the world as a whole, which has a different account of truth and goodness in it. But when they encounter this one, the one that follows from SIP, they ought to abandon that other one. That's what this argument says.
Okay.
It follows that tightly. There's a kind of power and a kind of coherence in this system that so this argument goes, you can't see outside of this power. It looks right to rational agents.
So at that part, they're not converging on truth and goodness. They're converging in other aspects.
At which point?
Or just when we're talking about another philosophy that converges.
If we're talking about another philosophy that has a different account of truth and goodness, then we have something to say about them. If we're talking about another account that does not have a different account of truth and goodness, but has other things to say, we're not talking about them in this argument. We're not addressing them in this argument. This argument is meant to clear the deck of rival standards of truth and goodness, period. Look at the conclusion. So no one should accept any rival to this first tradition-constituted account of goodness and truth. In other words, this thing right here. No one should accept any rival to this. Why not? Because when you spell this thing out and you see how this thing is suggested by it and functions as an endpoint in it, you say, oh, that's right. This is the endpoint of rational inquiry, so conceived, of rational inquiry, so conceived. I should stop there. You're not going to get anything out of this, any plausibility here, that's not already built in here somehow. That's the point of this implication, right? That what you need by way of truth and goodness is somehow built in here. Simply grant me this, and you're also going to grant me this once you see it. In other words, you also have to grant this. But not that you don't have to grant that it's true. That would be a question begging, right? I'm not asking you to grant that this is true. I'm just asking you to see it, to grant that it's coherent.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So we can build a machine like this little guy we built and keep looking at so many times. I'm going to see if I can flip back to him. You can build a machine like this, right? Where individual people are all over the place, are pulling in information about the world from so many different points of view. There's only 7 of them here, right? But you get the point. This is open-ended, right? These are conscious agents that we interact with.
Yeah.
That's sort of the bedrock set of possibilities here. There are other conscious agents, and we do interact with them. And when they chew through the world and digest and interact with and build new models, right? That do more and more work for them, that shed more and more light in terms of understanding, and that offer more and more promise in terms of direction. As they do that, and we compare them to one another in really rich, full information account ways, and we look at the outcomes there, maybe we learn a ton from these other people, and that's what happens. We learn from them. In effect, maybe we go there, right? Now we think like they do. Or maybe between the two of us, we put something new together that we really ought to define brand new afresh, right? That's a possibility, in which case a new community pops up here, made up of members of this community and this one.
Yeah.
Right? That's a possibility. All of that's the kind of dynamism that's promoted here.
Yeah.
But this algorithm is just a way of capturing what it is to be part of a rational community.
Yeah.
And once you grasp that possibility, you got to say, if this thing comes up with an answer, that's good. Yeah. I'm in. That's what I mean by good. That's what I mean by the best I could possibly accept about the world. Because this is an open-ended process here, right? If you don't have enough nodes in it, crank out some more, build some more. Not looking into enough, leave no stone unturned. This is a machine that investigates all of conscious experience, all conscious experientiables, if that's a word.
Yeah.
That's the domain over which this little thing operates. And what it cranks out, whatever passes for stability in the ascent that it generates, the inclinations that it elicits, right? It says, this is good. Whatever all that is, when you find stable pockets of it, you are moving toward what this thing is meant to do. And there's a theoretical ideal here, and that is that we don't only find local minima, but we find an absolute minima. And we fall into it and we say, this is good. This is the best account we have so far. If it happens to be the absolute minima, then we continue to add on that model, and our new conscious experiences grow that community.
Yeah. So how does exploration, let's see, if you fall, so using your example, if you fall into this pool, basically, right, following your model,
low potential energy,
the low potential energy, where does the impetus to explore come from? Right? I mean,
well, that's a good question.
Right? I mean, it seems like you're necessarily going to have to do seemingly irrational things. You might have to do seemingly irrational things to discover new information, or just to discover even areas of even lower potential.
Right.
But it seems like asking irrationally could be beneficial sometimes.
No, that's wonderfully right. And that's because I've done an inadequate job of describing what these low potential energy wells are. You're thinking of them as something in which people fall into them and they stop inquiring, right? As if they have the answers now.
Yeah.
And that, I think we recognize, is very likely to be no part of a potential energy well that you would stay in. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess my point in saying that is,
which means it's no part of a low potential energy well that anybody would stay in, according to you. No rational agents would stay in there. And I agree with you, they wouldn't. So I've just too poorly characterized so far. I've said too little or too much. I don't know which, right? Maybe the wrong analogy. I think the potential energy well does sound like a trap you can fall in, and it's not meant that way. We need another analogy to break out of that implication.
Yeah.
It's not a trap that you fall in. It is a benefit that you find. It's a pearl of great price. When you find it, you sell everything you have and you buy it. That is a low potential energy state, but you are rich. You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
And that would be included in that, right? Would be a rich model on which we can build inquiries in all kinds of different directions.
Yeah.
Right. And work together on the basis of something that we share in common because we've made some progress together.
Yeah.
And this is a good state of affairs. And I'm suggesting that when you're raised up in that way, when you're older, you won't depart from it. Again, using these scriptural analogies.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
That's a desirable state of affairs. And that's a feature, right? But it's not a trap. Even so, that was an unfortunate feature of my low potential energy well analogy. I think it's actually more than an analogy, but it just doesn't have that implication.
Yeah. I think the argument's coherent. At least it makes sense to me. But I just have this sort of my sort of technocratic utopian red flag warning is going off, if that makes sense. It's like,
of course.
Yeah, but like that, I don't really want to just be a transistor in the community computer, right? Like,
that's right.
I don't know, that's yeah.
So you should flag that, John, and we should come back and beat the crap out of this argument because it is ridiculous on its face if it sounds like that.
Yeah.
Don't you think? I mean, you're right. That is not just a warning flag. That's a lifeline, right? That's a lifeline. And I put it this way: the sort of response I just gave to the low potential energy well analogy has got to be given for that worry also.
Yeah.
Or we're going nowhere.
Right.
What this is supposed to do, and I think right, that being part of a community of learners who is genuinely ever increasing its cognitive capacity to enter into other people's points of view and to see oneself from those points of view and to share with them your own points of view, right? And to achieve some measure of agreement exactly and only when it seems justified and only that far to both of you. That does not sound like a chip in the on a motherboard. That sounds like a living, breathing, dynamic inquirer working with, receiving good from, and giving good to others. That's what that wiring is on the motherboard, so to speak. And when you put it that way, it's not so bad to be playing, this role, but not that role. That's right, you're playing this role. You came to the table in some certain order, right? You had the examples you had. You read the books that you read. That's not a bad thing to have come in some order. It's not bad to be in that particular space. It's bad to be horse blinded, right, by that upbringing. That's not good. Or to be exclusionary of other people, as if because you see it this way, those other people are something wrong with them. That is deep malfunction on the motherboard. That's an information trap, actually. Yeah. It only lets so much in, and it swirls around itself, and it congratulates itself for the rest of its life, unable to recognize that the minimum that it's in is a very shallow local minimum. It does. You wouldn't stay in there if there wasn't some stability to it. There is some stability to it. It answers it. It's a set of answers to your questions. You feel better. You have hope for the future. There's some prospects. So you think, right? You might be holding it together by being afraid to look, which is really a high cost. It cuts off your lifeline to more information, and and has you live in fear forever. This isn't heaven, this sucks, as a famous line from a movie comes to mind. Strange Brew. Guy's drowning in a beer tank. He used to think that would be heaven. And he discovered it's not. So yeah. That's not a great state of affairs. But that is a role on the motherboard, so to speak. Motherboard, again, a bad analogy. Sounds like mothership. Sounds like it's got all the wrong implications. But again, you got to take analogies only as far as they'll take you, right? And there's always disanalogies. There's models have limitations. And this is a model. Okay. Let's leave this then. All I really wanted to do for today, and I think the last time we got to this point, we said we could just go get the bottle of whiskey and just stay here and think some more, right? Because there's a lot going on, and we just took another pass at it, really. But we need to let it go for a little bit and just say, look, there is something like a deductive argument here. We can state what the principles are, right? We can use some logic, and we can draw some conclusions. And this might not be tightened up well enough yet, but I think the next one is an easier case. Because if we're going to go to conscious realism, we got to go from here to conscious realism. And we suggested earlier, right, that, there's a way to get there, sort of. It suggests, right, if truth and goodness really just are a kind of stability that conscious agents achieve as the information pours in and they process it in richer and richer ways. Right? If that's what truth and goodness is, then it does seem like conscious agents are playing some irreducible role. And maybe that suggests that conscious agents are real. Maybe that suggests conscious realism. Well, now what is conscious realism exactly? Right? So let's move to the next version of this slide. Lights up the second half. And you can, the nice thing about this is it's shorter. And look at the bottom. Only conscious experiences are real. Wow. So it goes to a big claim. Now, how on earth does it get there? Okay, it begins with this, again, we're just establishing some definitions here. It begins with this account, this entangled relational account, right? On that follows from SIP. On SIP, this account of truth and goodness that emerges from this SIP model, that account is true and that account is good, right? And these are sort of dimensions of the entanglement here. So I just want to sort of start with this holistic account of truth and goodness, nested in, literally implied by, right, this social information processing account and all that went into it. And here I'm just commenting out a section. Okay, this isn't actually doing any work.
Nice MATLAB references.
That's right. Yeah, both these account of the true and the good relate conscious agents who are informed by experiential information to everything else, experienceable. That is, they relate conscious agents to information about everything. And they say, insofar as you take in information about everything and you come up with a set of models and you assent to those models in a stable way, that is the mark of truth. When you assent, conscious agent, right? And when you incline toward what it offers you by way of movement forward, right? And you're inclined toward these things, it opens up a vista of of practical deliberation and practical achievement. It opens a way forward for you. It's also relating you, right, conscious agent, to all these goods, all these things you are inclined to achieve, insofar as you now see the world in this stable way. Okay? That's what's built in. That's what's the deliverance. That's this. Said differently. Okay? And now we start to argue. But if conscious agents were not real, and that is if CR were false, and here what I mean by CR is CRW, and I should fix that. I just hadn't introduced it yet. Okay. If this weak form of conscious realism were not so, that is, if conscious agents were not real, this account of truth and goodness would not be true or good. In fact, it wouldn't be coherent. It would not hang together. But it is, right? But on this account, on these basic premises we looked at, this high information flow network of rich communities, that's a coherent possibility. On that, this view of truth and goodness is in fact true and good. Okay, that's a restatement of this. It follows from that, right? Try denying that conscious agents are real, and this whole thing falls apart. So conscious realism is true in some weak sense. That we've already accepted when we accepted this. It's just pulling out that implication. So that is one sense in which, if we want to define what conscious realism is, we've got to say something about it. What do you mean by conscious realism? That's two words. Well, here's to say something about it, right? It implies that conscious agents are real, conscious realism, or conscious entities, if you don't like agents. And as you know, John, JP, because you listen to this podcast,
That's
right? This bothers Annika, perhaps. And that this is fine. It does not bother me, and we could go on and talk about it, but I haven't heard all our worries, so we'll see. Conscious entities are real if you don't think they're agents. Oh, I'm committed to the fact that they are agents, actually, even what I think agents are, but that's another story. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
I just think agents are exactly what.
Well, I just. I mean, I think it depends on how. I mean, if we don't believe in what's the phrase? Libertarian free will, is that sort of the?
That's a good phrase.
Right. I mean, there's really like, isn't there really three positions? There's libertarian free will, consequentialism, and no free will.
You mean compatibilism?
Oh, yeah, compatibilism. Right? Sorry.
And no free will, which is determinism often.
Determinism, right? So
yes, that's right. And you're pointing out that maybe agency smuggles in.
It seems it's I think for most people it smuggles in libertarian free will, but
that's because they're libertarians. That's the only way they see agents. They say, "Boy, if you didn't have that, you wouldn't be an agent." Well, I get it. That is exactly what it is to be a libertarian, and that can be cured. I think, and I think you're chewing on something. I think you can cure that, actually.
I have not been cured of that. So
good.
I'd be willing to take my medicine sometime.
Sure. Sure. Well, let's have at it one of these nights.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm saying that conscious realism in some weak sense follows already from SIP. It's built in there. Okay. And in order to see that, this whole account here, right, in which conscious agents achieve a certain kind of stability, obviously it's presuming conscious agents. There may be a much quicker way to this than I realized. But anyway, this, in some weak sense, this is true. But let's go a little further. The rest of what is real. So what if conscious agents are real, but they're not the only things? The rest of what is real, and I take it here, and here I think I'm acting like Albert Einstein, but I'll have to look up and remind myself why. I think whatever can be described truly is real for Einstein. And so whatever can be described truly also depends on conscious agents on this model.
Yes, that makes sense.
Right. Okay. Therefore, here's
Given
a
our
stronger
definition of
sense of
truth.
conscious realism. All of reality depends on conscious agents. The rest of what is real depends on conscious agents. Therefore, all of reality does, right? Conscious agents depend on conscious agents. And everything that's not a conscious agent, the rest of what's real, depends on conscious agents, according to this model of what it is to be true, and this model of what it is to be real. All I need for now, we can revisit this. All I need for now is it looks like this is a deductive argument. And I don't think I've stated it as well as I could. But let's keep moving a little bit, and feel free, we can stop and just blow holes at this if we want to. But I do propose, all I really want to say, just look at this, at the rest of it, okay? I'm going further and I'm saying only conscious experiences depend on conscious agents. Now, let that premise stop, jump in for a moment. Only conscious experiences depend on conscious agents. What it is to be a conscious agent is to experience things consciously. And that's it. If you did experiencing consciously, would it follow that you were a conscious agent? I think it would.
Yes.
And is this a restatement of that claim? Only conscious experiences depend on conscious agents. No, it is not a restatement of that claim. It is what? It is, here I'm applying Occam's razor to conscious agency. What I mean is, if you're going to postulate conscious agency, what is it you have to postulate in order to get there? Answer, there are conscious experiences. And they are the things that inform, they are the experiences of conscious agents. Information informs. To be information is to inform, was one way in which we put this little I up here. To inform, to inform conscious agents. So if you take that as what it is, all you mean when you assert that there are conscious agents. There are conscious experiences, and thus there are conscious agents. They're the ones who have the conscious experiences. If you take that, and that's what you mean by the assertion of conscious agency, then the only thing you've let in here is conscious experiences. That's all that depends upon conscious agents. There's certainly nothing else we've built in, and nothing else we seem to need to build in. So apply Occam's razor, take conscious agency in precisely and only that sense. You're a conscious agent if you have conscious experiences. End of story. But you define truth in terms of the stable states that those conscious agents come to as they process their conscious experience.
it's the let's see. I mean, it seems like we're just saying. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. If you're
no. This is for you too. You bet.
Let's see. It seems like we're just finding a way. We're saying that information has to inform, right? If there's information, then it has to inform somebody.
We're starting with info. We need less than that to start. We need that there is information that does inform somebody.
There is information, right?
That does inform somebody. Let's just start with those somebodies. Let's start with those conscious agents.
Yeah.
No, I'm not interested in anything outside of conscious agents yet. I'm not depending on any homomorphism between conscious agents and the causes of their conscious states.
Okay.
Right? Not doing any of that. I'm just starting with conscious agents. And I'm just starting of that sense of information in which there is such a thing as what informs conscious agents. It is conscious experiences.
Yeah.
Those are information in a sense of information. That's all I need to start, I think.
Okay.
And then I'm saying that there is a standard of truth which arises out of the internal life of conscious agents. And it is the only standard of truth that you're entitled to. And what we mean by real are the things out there in the world, the things that exist anywhere. Let me rephrase that. What we mean by real are the things that exist anywhere which can be truly spoken of. It is true that this exists. If it's not true that it exists, it is not any part of reality that has anything to do with us.
Right.
There may be some other, you can imagine some unconnected pool of conscious agents somewhere else. They might be noticing it. And then this argument would work for them about that. That, in effect, would be an alternative. That is a great example, a great description of what we mean by an alternative reality.
Yeah.
That is not the world we live in. We have zero, in principle, zero access to it. I just imagined it shut off.
Yeah.
There are no true claims we can make about anything in that world. We cannot know it. We cannot get a clue.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If there's such a thing, that's a different reality. I can't preclude it. It doesn't really make sense unless there's some other set of agents who can introduce us to those agents in some way. What if there's another sense that's not cut off, another set of agents that's not cut off from them and that's not cut off from us? Oh, this is starting to sound like non-cognitive contact, actually.
There you go.
These guys can put me in non-cognitive contact with them in a certain way. They can tell me stories about them, and I can come to trust these agents. They could tell me stories about those other agents, and I could believe those stories. And I could, in that sense, be in touch. I might even be able to learn from them, even though I've got no access to them myself, except this. Well, it turns out I do have access to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyway.
So, are we saying
once you
something
step
more?
Into this place,
are we saying something more than if something's real? Nothing. If something's real, the only way we know something's real is if it can be sensed in somehow, like, or something is something can be conscious of it, right? If in principle no one can ever have any conscious experience of it in any way, or then it's not real.
That is right here. The real is what can be described truly.
Yeah.
If you got another sense of what is real, you're welcome to it. I'll settle for this one.
Okay.
Now, maybe we are ambiguating over truth. Maybe our previous argument was wrong when we said that this implies this standard of truth. Right? Maybe we should go back and look, because now this thing's starting to do some work for us. You're starting to say, wait a minute. You mean truth gets at what's real? That's what we mean by what's real. That's exactly what I mean. Well, how do you know that? Or, well, I'm putting together a number of first principles here, and I'm putting the world together in a certain way. And we're going to go on to talk about how do we know that, and what's, I'm saying that beyond suggestion, there's implication here. This seems like it's meant to get, and I'm not sure I've quite got it. I'm quite sure I don't have it well yet, but I am quite sure that there are head and shoulder fakes being made toward a deductive argument here, right? I may not have actually cashed it in yet, but I mean to be proceeding from premises according to the laws of logic. And if that's the attempt that's made here. And what follows from this is that only conscious experiences are real. And this is conscious realism. And this deserves a capital S, because that's a big, crazy ass claim.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy in the sense that almost everybody would deny it.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm saying, maybe you would deny it, but you're not entitled to deny it. Not if you grant this innocuous set of premises, because it follows from this innocuous set of premises. So watch out what you grant.
So, I mean, it seems like we're just saying there's no such thing as objective reality, because if it's real, then there's a subject.
Well,
right?
It depends on what
everything
you mean by
everything is a subject. Everything's a subject,
John, because I have a different to say. You're supposing that what is objectively real and what is subjectively real could not overlap, and I'm saying yes, they can.
Okay, so you're saying that they, but it seems like by our argument that means it has to be a perfect match between the two, right? There isn't anything. All we're saying is that, or what you're saying is that if anything is real, if anything is objectively real, it is also subjectively real.
Yes.
Right?
That's exactly right. That is conscious realism right there in a nutshell.
Yeah. Okay. And so then the objective reality doesn't really, there's no point in even distinguishing between the two, it seems like.
No, I think that's not true. Now we're going to have to go on to say, I think objective reality does a lot of work for us. That's because I think your subjective experiences are subject to change. They can be massaged by what? Well, by other conscious agents who are themselves in contact with other consciously experienceable facets of reality. That is, of the bunch of things that can be truly spoken of. The bunch of things that are part of the world when described by agents who have achieved a stable relationship with the whole of it. And that's suggesting a pretty highly informed, a rich community. Actually, it's a scientific community, right? Remember the parallels between the scientific disciplines we were looking at. I'm suggesting there's a single science here, which is the integration of all those deliverances of all the particular sciences. Nobody's trying it, but it is doable. It is a coherent outcome. And there's an algorithm for comparing its results to others. This is an empirical study. And there's an empirical outcome of running this algorithm. This algorithm is computing something, the network of all the conscious agents that there are that are connected to one another, I should say. If they're not connected to one another, we have no way of speaking about whether they are or not. They are in principle unconnected to us. But all the conscious agents that there are in that sense of can be truly spoken about, in that sense of real, all those conscious agents may well arrive at a set, and it may be a set of one, or it may be a set of more than one, enduringly stable ways of looking at the world. And your subjective experience earlier gives way to the therapy that those folks have learned to bring your way. They have rhetorical resources to persuade you. They can show you some things you didn't know, to put it in ordinary parlance.
Yeah.
And if you submit yourself in that sense, there's a scary word, but it's not so scary, for example, if we were submitting ourselves to a Michelangelo who wanted to teach us to paint eyes that move, right? Or to, what is his name? Mori, I forget Mushiba's first name, was Shiba, the founder of Aikijitsu, right? That sensei, what do you do with that sensei? Go and talk to him like a peer about the things that he knows? No, right? You enter into and you let yourself be formed through a kind of massage, a kind of therapy on your experiences. And then you become much, much better at whatever it is they're good at, whatever that particular craft is. And that's true of all kinds of crafts. And there is a master craft of integrating all of the crafts, including the integration of all of the crafts from more than one point of view. There is a master craft of engaging those integrated accounts. And the deliverances of that master craft, insofar as they achieve stability that endures, those deliverances are objectively real. And not all the experiences that people had otherwise. There are real claims in the neighborhood. It was true that you experienced this, and it was true that you thought this, and it was true that you believed this. And it was true that you were computing. There's a bazillion cool, and it's part of the therapy is simply to recount the number of truths here. But I could go on a long time. But all the things that are true, right? That all of that is true. There's many things that are true, but there's also some things that are false. The claims you would have made in various states along the way, those claims are false. They were your claims. So they were your subjective experience, but they were not objectively true. You see what I'm saying? There is
yes.
Here.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So I mean so we're saying objective. There is a spectrum of individual subject. Like I have a subjective reality, right?
Right.
Or I experience some subject reality.
You subjective reality experiences.
I have subjective experiences. Yeah. Which inform me about objective reality.
They start to,
right? But I'm just one node in my, I'm just one piece of the puzzle. And so there could be, I mean, as you incorporate more information into, like I could just learn more, right? Or I could just learn more And as I learn more, my experience approaches objective reality more and more.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Not maybe in a linear way. You may be heading down a rabbit hole.
Sure.
Right. There may be some real traps in that neighborhood that are hard to get out of.
Yeah.
But yes, in general, information improves your choices and moves you in the direction of stability. It may be local minima, and you may have to pop out of those local minima.
Yeah.
And you might be able to do that on your own, or maybe someone has to help you.
Yeah. I think it makes sense to me. But I do think I think the argument makes sense to me. But I do think that there is I do want to come back to some pieces of it. Because I think we could have some interesting conversations about what the good is and how much we need to incorporate rationality into that, like how essential being rational is to that.
What about freedom? Is there freedom to be rational? Is that a mode of expression? I'm trying to pick up. I mean, I'm trying to follow your line a little bit.
Well, let's see.
What about creativity?
I guess what I would say is there's like that there could be some things that that are good that it would be hard to empirically measure, right? That gathering information about particular things could be challenging, while also right and so then you have things that it seems like there are good things that empiricism just fails to get us there. Anyway, I'm not sure about that. I'm thinking about
it. I agree. So one of the things we might do is now go back to that three rival versions of non-moral goodness paper, because we could at the very least start and see if we can better improve arguments along this line that you're making now that are made there.
Okay.
There are some claims that are made there. And we've got some resources there. We've got some resources there. And I think John Rose used a phrase the other day talking about the ideal tradition and the role of the ideal tradition. It brings resources to the table. You might remember there's the possibility that a tradition has a theory of kinds of persons. This is that kind of person. This is a different kind of person. You could get to know persons. There could be unique blends of various kinds, right? Things like that. And it could be that there are certain kinds of persons who cannot experience certain kinds of things, but other kinds of persons could. And for example, we talked about sort of parallel processing, but is it possible that some kinds of people could venture into some sorts of experiences that other kinds of persons couldn't venture into? And yet when they venture, they bring back a story, a learning from there. Could you learn about things that you could not yourself experience in that way? That's an example, right, of the kinds of things. And maybe we ought not to go to that paper, because maybe it'd be better if you invented your own objections. Right. So let's go back to, I mean, by all means, we ought to, and here I'm looking for help from you both in terms of how to proceed, just your preferences. What I thought is useful, I wanted to do one more thing that is right along the same lines as what we just did, because we just got to a We just proposed that this strange conclusion can actually follow, right? And here it's basically this thing, right? Oops. Conscious realism in a strong sense, right? Not this very weakest sense in which conscious agents are real, or not a stronger sense in which all of reality depends in some way on conscious agents, but that conscious experiences are the only things that there are. That's a pretty strong claim. And I'm suggesting that this will do it for you. This, with an application of Occam's razor, this will get you everything you want. And we just didn't know that before. That's what I think is emerging from, certainly that's where Donald Hoffman's going, I think. Remember, he thinks that he's going to try to get relativity, quantum mechanics, quantum gravity, tensor logic, all sorts of things that are in the quantum gravity discussion that are over my head, or at least that I haven't followed very hard. All of that stuff, the principles of natural selection, all of that, he thinks you've got to get, because that's all true, as he says, on our desktop. Right? Mm-hmm. It's all, is that the right phrase that he uses? Those are things that are said about our desktop. And I think he wants to say they're true. And I think he could buy this account of what it is for something to be true. But those things are said about space and time, and about biology, about chemistry, about the physical world. And all of that actually is our desktop, according to him. So he thinks that there's a great deal that can come out of this conscious realism desktop. He thinks there's a mathematics that describes the relationship between conscious agents, and it's simple. It's simple and powerful, and it can produce an enormous amount. And doesn't that sound like Wolfram's project, by the way?
Yeah.
Right. Sounds an awful lot like Wolfram's project, only he's starting with a simple mathematics that is not a that produces space and time. And by the way, it better produce natural selection also. On Wolfram, because it produces everything. It produces the world we experience gets produced out of the interplay, right, of these mathematical relations. Is this a different project? Well, that depends on where those mathematical relations sit. What if they sit inside the conscious entities? What if they inform conscious entities and the whole computation is taking place there? I don't see anything that Wolfram has to say that precludes that. I haven't seen anything that Hoffman has to say that precludes Wolfram's project from having a home in Hoffman's project. Except the mathematics that they develop may be incompatible. There's a lot of math to do there.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the conscious realism bit yet. I just haven't really learned enough about that. And so part of me is at this point, the idea of only conscious experiences being real, just it's hard for me to understand what that means, because I feel like I could just imagine some obscure chunk of the observable universe, right? And it's like, there's something real over there, right? We have every reason to think that there's something real over there.
But no one anywhere experiences it or ever will.
Right. And so
you have to admit,
I guess it's like no one's going to consciously experience. I mean, from as far as we're concerned, it might as well not be real, right? But we have every reason to think that there is some information over there.
If we have every reason to think it, aren't we interacting with it already in some way? I don't trust my answer there.
Yes.
That's my instinctive answer. So let's probe it.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me we have an idea about the observable like how big the observable universe is based on the speed of light and I'm not entirely sure how we came up with the size of the observable universe, but my guess is it's just based on some mathematical equations, right? That would be my guess.
Sure.
So we're just coming up with math that explains somewhat what we are experiencing, and I don't know. It seems like that's hard.
It is hard.
It's hard to say that we really have a relationship with that, something that we just sort of conjecture. We have equations that explain a lot and say that there probably should be things over there.
Well,
I don't know. It's just like,
how about the way of an electron, John, before it's observed? How about the what? How about the position and velocity of an electron before it's observed? There's a reason I'm going to that space, right? I'm going to quantum mechanics on purpose because aren't there very similar sorts of problems in quantum mechanics?
No, you're right. It is the exact same sort of problem.
It seems to have a similar form.
It does have
Now,
no, you're right. It's just, I like space and time a lot, you know?
Yep. So, right.
But you're absolutely right.
I think it's the case that conscious realism is going to resolve for us. I think it has promise for resolving for us some of the mysteries around quantum mechanics, particularly what they call the measurement problem or the observer problem. The question is, don't you have to observe it in order to measure it? Does it have no status? What is its status before you measure it? It seems like its status is some kind of superposition of possibilities, but when you actually observe it, it's all in one of them.
Yeah.
Right? I think I've just tried to give a description of the collapse of the wave packet or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Whether that's an objective collapse, what's going on there. There's all kinds of different, call them interpretations. I used to think that these were interpretations. Sean Carroll, I've learned from Sean Carroll that there are quantitatively distinguishable, falsifiable research programs around these various pieces, these various interpretations. So they're not really interpretations anymore. They're not philosophical interpretations of science. They're actually different scientific accounts. I think that's the way Sean Carroll describes it.
But that idea maps onto the computational irreducibility that Wolfram talks about, right?
How so?
Or am I just mean that it needs to be observed, like the fact that it's being observed, right? I mean, it is this space of possibilities, but that's the role of the observer, it seems to me. Like you actually just need to look at it. Like the next step needs to take place.
Yes. What if the universe were being computed by conscious agents? What if there's no answer until somebody runs the computation? Now, it's not surprising that there's no answer until somebody runs the computation.
Yeah.
Not if those answers are unfolding. What if it is that's unfolding is a conscious experience? That's what comes out, a new conscious experience. My experience of this thing here, of this electron in this state. That's what comes out. I forget there's a guy who describes this state of affairs on a model of 20 questions. And he's a well-known science writer. And I heard him give this talk inside in what's it called? The Royal Society, something like that, in the very chamber where all kinds of major physics happening took place. And there's an ongoing series of lectures out of there. And this guy was invited to give one of those lectures. He's no fool, but unfortunately I haven't interacted with him a lot. I've seen a couple lectures of his and I don't even remember his name at the moment, but my fault, not his. I'm sure he's a big deal or he wouldn't have been in that hall. But he uses a 20 question analogy for this whole state of affairs. He says, we play 20 questions in two different ways. One of them is you pick an object, right? And so you got an object in mind? Okay. And now I get to ask you 20 questions. And I come after that object and I either get it within 20 questions or I don't. You know the game. That's one typical way of thinking about it. But there's another way to play it. You say, okay, go. I say to you, okay, go. In fact, I've played myself 20 questions this way for years because I'm competitive and I'd rather win. So when I say, have I picked an object, basically I'm lying. I did this when I was a kid and I think I still play it this way. I just haven't played it this way in a long time. But there is something disingenuous about depending on how you enter this game. Because you don't really have an object in mind. You're just going to answer questions with yes or no. And you're going to keep jumping to the open area, what's the phrase? We use it in excluded, the unexcluded area.
Unexcluded. This way you get to play at the same time as the other person.
Exactly. You don't just sit there and answer questions. It's an interesting game that way. And they still get to have the same amount of fun. They're asking every question you get. Their job is to find a box that's too small for there to be more than one object in within 20 questions. And my job is to jump around, right, but in the answers I give so that I don't get trapped in one of those little boxes.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, suppose it's the case that when we're interacting with things, the quantum world, it's like the second set of 20 questions. There is no place the electron is. There's only a place it is when we pin it down. Right? And that it makes no sense at all, even though it looks like that. Right. And that's mystifying. And it's the observer problem in quantum mechanics.
Yeah. So we just eventually got good enough. We just eventually got good enough at the game for it to have to be somewhere. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not following you there, but I was on a point that I love and probably was just loving hearing myself talk. So I'll try to keep this short in case it's the latter. But because I think this is cool, I think there's a problem. The measurement problem is a problem. The status of observers is a problem in quantum mechanics. Only if you're a physicalist, and then you wonder who on earth's doing the observing. I mean, the jokes are about Schrodinger's cat. Does Schrodinger's cat do the observing? Another time we'll tell the story. Maybe you know the story. The cat's either alive or dead because his life depends upon whether or not some truly random event was triggered at an event which a quantum event takes place. It either takes place, in which case the cat's dead, or it doesn't take place, in which he's alive. And you seal that whole system up in a box. Right. And then you say, well, no one's observing whether it took place or not. It's a quantum event, right? What happens? Is it when we open the box that we determine what happens? Because we're the observer? Or is the cat the observer? Or is all the molecules interacting around, are they observers? What on earth are observers? This whole thing is nuts. It breaks down, incoherent, something like that is the smoke they throw at a number of people throw at quantum mechanics, probably people who understand it as poorly as I do. But that's the observer problem, it seems to me, or the measurement problem. Because to measure, you got to observe, you got to interact. But that's only a problem if there's anything other than observers. If only conscious experiences are real, there isn't anything other than observers. And all those results that are coming out are the results of the computations of conscious observers. Now, you have to admit it doesn't look like that. You look in the box, the cat might be conscious in some sense, but suppose you took the cat out and you put some very, very small form of life, an amoeba whose life depended upon it. Is that an observer? Where's the observer? Or is that whole state of affairs, as Hoffman would say, that whole state of affairs is held up as the desktop interface? There is no reality outside of the desktop interface, which is the physical world, which is what conscious agents perceive. In a whole network of conscious agents, and you're not the only one. You're just one of them. And you're not the most powerful one, it turns out, according to Hoffman, as you heard him say in Harris's interaction, because it turns out when there is, what does he say? Does there have to be exchange, or is just exchangeability enough for the two of them also to form a higher consciousness? He says he says that drops out of the mathematics of conscious agents. I don't know if you followed that part, either of you, if you listen to Harris down that road.
I must have missed that.
Harris,
I think that
Hoffman. Yeah.
The significance must have gone over my head.
Maybe so. And I say it a bunch of times, and I read his conscious realism book, so I've had a few passes. But I think it's fair to say that he does say that, right? That's the physical reality is a desktop interface for conscious agents. That's his view of the world. That's his conscious realism. And I'm suggesting, boy, this is pretty amazing. You don't have to start from very much in order to get to where he is. And I think, then why doesn't everybody get there? I'll tell you why they don't get there. Because this looks implausible. And it looks implausible. It looks either implausible, the whole of it looks implausible. The whole of it, I shouldn't say implausible. Let me do this carefully. People do not consider this thing. Oops, wrong one, sorry. This thing. People don't think of networks of conscious agents in these terms, as if we're computing some great big one thing. Why don't they think that? Because it's impossible. Nobody knows how to do that. We don't do that. We don't compute some great big thing. I'm saying, without committing McIntyre to it, that our not computing that great big thing is a consequence of what I'm going to tongue-in-cheek call the fall. Whatever that big catastrophe was that McIntyre talks about at the beginning of After Virtue, that wipes out, as if it wiped out science, right? It wipes out something enormous. And what it wipes out is even the kind of academic history, the kind of history we actually need, as opposed to the kind of doomed from the start, written, soaked through with the consequences of this unrecognized catastrophe, modern history. Remember that whole conversation. He's saying something very big was lost. And I'm saying, you bet it was lost. I think I can tell you what it is. I learned what it is that was lost from him, and we could get it back. It is computational politics. And the only reason this is unusual, this sort of model here is unusual, is because people don't have hope that we can build it. It's not that hard to figure out.
I mean, let's see. It seems like, what are we saying? what I'm having a hard time understanding, let's see, what was lost. It seems
Yes.
like we're just saying rationality, people living in rational communities,
Yeah.
rational exploratory communities,
Right.
and incorporating all areas of life into that.
That's
right?
exactly it, John. But look how radical that is. It's not that radical to you. It just takes things that you've experienced, which are radical, and it takes them further. Because you know that people can sell about everything they have and live their whole lives together, trying their very best to put together a coherent account of the world and to live out its implications together. You know they can do that because you grew up in such a community. It's not crazy. A community of learners is not crazy for you. I don't mean that phrase isn't unique, of course, to somebody with these rich aspirations, but it is absolutely at home for people who have this rich set of aspirations. And the people who have this rich set of aspirations, I'm saying, need to go a lot farther. And they need to go a lot farther. And when they do, they'll actually discover this possibility, which is the possibility, what I'm naming computational politics. There are other names for it. And I'm going to jump way ahead to another name for it. And that is, this is bringing God's wise and loving rule to all of creation. That's N.T. Wright's name for it.
I had a question thinking about the historical part of it.
Yes.
Whether or not it existed before is interesting. But is it relevant that it existed before and we're trying to recreate it rather than just coming up with something new?
That's a good question. I think it is relevant in a couple ways. Number one, if it's not coherent, everything follows, right? If it's got a contradiction built into it, which is it may be a naive way. I haven't thought real hard about or studied the question as to whether coherence actually implies that there's a contradiction built into it, but I think it does, and that's what I mean by coherence. I think that's what I mean by coherence. So if it's coherent, the question of whether it's coherent, it matters. And if it's been actually pursued for millennia, that it's coherent shines a little more brightly as a possibility. People thought it was coherent for a really long time, and in fact, they made a lot of progress based on it. Imagine somebody said there's a whole different way of engineering, right? And you wonder, gee, is that right? Or does this whole thing fall apart? Is it incoherent? And somebody says, well, look, they built buildings, right? Yeah. If you want to understand, isn't that some evidence that they're onto something that's not incoherent? And maybe it is. It's at least suggests that you give it a good look.
The length of time lends to its credibility?
It's an existence proof. You see what I mean? This could be built. It already has been built. And maybe it falls apart, but it didn't fall apart for a really long time. In fact, it did fall apart. That falling apart is this catastrophe that McIntyre writes about, I want to say. But we can analyze that collapse. McIntyre has analyzed the collapse. And I could give you a short history of that collapse. And it makes sense to me, though it's very hard to know enough history for it to really be, it's to escape from somebody else's story. It's hard to get that story on your own from primary sources. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to translate a bunch of stuff that might be untranslatable. For example, it's very hard to recapture. This is why, remember, at the end of his disquieting suggestion, he says, no idea how to get this back, right? It's really pretty depressing, except we don't have the luxury of being depressed about it. Maybe he didn't say depressed, maybe he used a different word, but it was like that. Discouraged maybe was the phrase he used. That it's too hard to get back. And I'm saying, actually, it's not as hard to get back as he thinks, because he wasn't, when he was writing that, paying attention to the incredible amount of resources that are available to us. It is, and you've already heard this story, right? You've already heard this sort of preaching that we could build a high information flow network of rich communities. Yeah, we could build it. We even have a model for how to build it. We need to build a self-assembling monolayer, and we need to release it. That's how you would build at scale. That's how we build anything at scale. How do we know that? Because we build tons of stuff at incredible scale these days. And this is the pattern we follow. We also have computational resources to help us. And that's something McIntyre did not envision in 1981. Maybe he did. I mean, this was a long time after Turing, but it was a long time before, it was a while before the personal computer. And even that, right, where that's going. It was a long time before the internet was even thought about, right? It was a long time before machine learning, all of those things. And those are incredibly powerful tools that are brand new.
So what are we inviting people into, except to be rational and expose and take part in gathering and processing more information together? Because it seems like that's what people are doing
already,
and they're just deciding, or they're just participating in systems that actually don't give them that much information, right? Or they're not acting rationally.
That's right. And I think actually it's the latter. I don't mean, and that phrase needs to be distinguished. When I say people are not acting rationally, I don't mean they're not acting rationally in any respects. They are very obviously, very productively acting rationally in incredibly many respects. But if they have shut down the possibility of further information being sought, or when sought, processed, insofar as they're shutting that down, there is exactly an irrational component. And it is the case that humankind is asleep with its head in the sand. That is an accusation that's got to be made. And it's not just my accusation. McIntyre would be, not to put my words in his mouth, but he put his own words in his mouth. And it is true that you cannot achieve rationality except in the context of a certain kind of community. And those communities generally don't exist. So you are literally throwing away information. Just look at us in the polarization that we're practicing. Very bright people, very rational people, deeply polarized, and already aren't they throwing out huge chunks of information from other communities with other perspectives that are richly processing the world from their own perspectives? And isn't it the norm that we put up with a situation in which we are cut off from those people? And isn't that irrational? Because we live in the wrong kind of human community. I think that's the answer to your question, John, in a way, we are being asked to be rational. And this requires us to go further than we currently now go. Part of that is we don't have much hope. We run into problems that seem insurmountable to us, and so we don't overcome them. We don't attack them. And that's precisely what building a whole system of thought and practice is. Who's doing that? Hardly anybody. So there's a lot in conscious realism. This is you have to admit, this is a pretty interesting time. Believe me, I didn't run right out the first time all these things occurred to me and just start writing about them, because they're too weird to write about. Honestly, I've thought that for a really long time, and you can kind of see why now. These things coming together on the verge of some big new thing is what McIntyre points to. So this is not like this is quite related to McIntyre's project. It is not without plausibility. It is not without being a great big paradigm change. It happens to be the very same paradigm. Happens to be, what's the phrase? It happens to harmonize in time. It's fortuitous that other kinds of epistemological crises are happening in other disciplines, happening in quantum mechanics with regard to its interaction with relativity, or even in terms of the internal coherence of quantum mechanics. And I do think there's quite a bit there. Some people say reality's out the window just based upon quantum mechanical findings, not based upon whether or not we've got some coherence with relativity. That's another whole issue. So there are epistemological crises in these various disciplines. And what Hoffman's saying is, don't explore the space. You heard him say this, perhaps, in his interview with the Harrisons. Don't explore this space. It doesn't make sense to explore this space only where everybody else is exploring it. We should explore it in some outlying places also. In particular, we've got no resolution for the problem of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. Nobody knows what it is because they think it emerges from physical world, the physical world which is eroding beneath our own inquiry. So he's saying, okay, what if we turn it around and see if we can build a physical world from consciousness? What a wild way to approach the hard problem. That's his new one. Except it's not that hard. It's better. Go ahead.
It's unclear to me, and I thought this came up in that interview. It's unclear that that's actually going to answer the hard problem of consciousness, though. Right? I mean,
it might be unclear.
And I thought he agreed in that interview that it doesn't necessarily.
Good. Yeah, he may have done something like that. Do you think he did it, John, when he said, and I realize we were quite late in the conversation here, and this can't last forever.
Not enough time in the day.
Yep. So why don't we put a pin in it right there? You're exactly right. I do think he, let's come back to it. When we come back to it, we're going to say Hoffman has more resources than he realizes, according to me. And that's the very next thing we're going to do. We're going to look at, hardly anybody puts together wholes from first principles. It's not something that people have a lot, they're not used to doing it. There's a lot of resources for doing it that are not generally being tapped. And there are resources which I've seen in Hoffman's answers, he's not yet tapping. Okay, that's one thing I want to say about him. He's going to be happy when he does tap them. He's probably way ahead of me. He's just not saying them. When he uses the phrase that first principles are analogous to miracles, when he puts it that way, I think he's missing the boat. They're not analogous to miracles. They are not random first principles, as if every science has got to start somewhere. Just grab some old principle and see what it does, and it functions as a miracle for you. No, it doesn't. There's a lot of relationship between first principles in various areas, only if you look there, and people generally don't. But there's been a whole science of looking there. It's part of what we threw out. And you can see it plain as day in Plato. You can see it plain as day in how he describes reasoning, and you can see it plain as day when you read the Republic 3 or 4 times. In the dialogue, in the pattern that is being followed. It's the kind of interaction with the way Plato has Socrates argue with Glaucon, the way and Adimantus, the way he has them argue is the way you have to argue, given what dialectic is, given the way you make progress toward first principles. And that has not been well enough understood. And when it is, there will be more resources that come to bear, for Hoffman in particular. On that, we should quit. We've been at it for 2 hours.
All righty.
All right.
Thanks,
so
guys.
Dialectical reasoning on Monday then.
I think so. Yeah, we'll take and there. Then I think, by the way, we should look ahead at a much faster rate of speed, not doing things, but talking about things we might do. Because I don't necessarily, you guys are now in a position to see enough of this that you can begin to have your own preferences for where we go next, it seems to me. And I'd like to start hearing some of those preferences and responding to them. Whereas I think that was less true when we started.
Okay.
All right. Well, it's good. Unfortunately, it's not good seeing you, because it's still the case that my software has left me behind to both of you this evening. But trusting you is as good looking as ever. And see you next time.
Yep. Have a good night, guys.
Yeah. See you guys.
See you guys.